It's been a while since I've caught up with my next guest, and there's definitely a bit to talk about. From sky-high COVID prices to the post-pandemic slump, New Zealand's property market's been on a bit of a rollercoaster ride. But with mortgage rates falling and listings on the up, we are seeing a return to a more stable market. Also, the residential tenancy unfair rent increases amendment bill. Why are they always so long? Basically, it's a members' bill. In the name of Labour MP Glenn Bennett, who wants to change the existing laws governing how often the rent can be increased. Well, we know that you can't put it up more than once a year anyway. I know, but he's got another idea. He wants it so that if the tenancy is changed several times over said year, the rent can only go up once. Also, do you want the good news or the bad news? Well, the good news that our economy, the New Zealand economy, has climbed out of recession after GDP rose by 0.7%. The economy had previously met the widely accepted definition of recession with 2 successive quarters of contraction. The bad news? Well, for the government, they've been given a rating of 4.2 out of 10 in the latest Ipsos Issues Monitor survey. That's the lowest on record since it started measuring in mid-2017. So, what else are we going to talk about with my guest? What we need is to make New Zealand first again. See what he's done? Winston Peters. Make New Zealand first again. He held a State of the Nation speech yesterday in Christchurch, and there were protests within the facility and out of the facility. So like I said, we've got a lot to talk about with market and political commentator Ashley Church. Ash, hello.
I was just excited to hear who you're going to talk to about all those things. What a great list.
Who is this person? Gosh, I hope they know a lot.
I do too.
Yeah.
I do too. I'm sitting back and listening.
Oh, nice. Well, we couldn't get that person, Ashley, so we've got you. I'm only
No, fair
kidding.
enough.
No. Hey, look, I know, my friend, we've touched on this before, but new data from CoreLogic shows there were 31,838 properties on the market nationwide. That's 26% up on the 5-year average. Is the market flooded?
Yeah, so it's a wash. It's a wash with properties at the moment, and that's largely the result of people who didn't have to sell over the last couple of years choosing not to because obviously prices were going backward, and so people were concerned that if they put their house on the market, they would get less for it than they wanted. The fact that we are awash with listings is a positive side, if you want to take something positive out of it, in the sense that people are doing it because they feel a bit more confident that prices are stabilised. So that's all good. But it does mean that prices will stay stable for a while longer because we will need to eat that stock up. And, that could take anything from, 3 months to a year, depending on where you are around the country and what's happening with listings elsewhere. So it's a good thing if you're a buyer. It's probably not as good as you might want it to be if you're a seller, but generally it's headed in the right direction.
Well, that was my next question then. Is it a buyer's market? One would say yes.
Yeah, pretty much it is at the moment. Although it's less of a buyer's market, to be fair, than it was for the last 2 or 3 years. It's been a hugely buyer's market for a long time because basically you could offer whatever you wanted, and if somebody was in a distressed position, they would have to accept it. That's no longer true. But so now probably the biggest impact of this is that it's going to take longer for you to sell a property than you might have otherwise wanted it to take.
Yeah. Let's quickly talk mortgage rates, Ashley. While most borrowers are still reluctant to fix for more than 12 months, lenders are starting to offer more tempting 2 and 3 year rates. Is there a rates war brewing?
Well, it's a rates war because there's a, far be it for me to use the word collusion, but there's certainly a high degree of unanimity around the rates that are currently being offered by the various banks. What is interesting, though, is that the 2-year rate seems to be settling at around that 4.99 mark. So, for example, I know BNZ, and I suspect they're all going to be similar to this. BNZ, I think their 6-month rate at the moment is 5.79. I think their 12-month rate's 5.59, and then it drops right down to a quite tempting 4.99, which tells you that and then it starts going up again. Their 3 and 4 year rates are actually higher than that. So that's interesting because that tells you where they think it's going to settle, and that they obviously can't see beyond that 2-year horizon. You can't blame them for that.
Yeah.
What it does tell you, what is interesting about that though, is that the long run average over the last 20 odd years for mortgage interest rates is about 4.5%. So we're getting pretty close to that point now on those 2-year rates. So what that probably means is that people who are looking at fixing again might be more tempted by that rate than they perhaps were in the last 12 months, where they've been where people have basically been refixing for 6 months and then 6 months again as that comes up for renewal, because they all knew that rates were coming down.
Yeah. Nobody's saying housing is cheap, but it's the most affordable it's been since, 2019, actually. On some measures, how is house affordability tracking in what you've seen?
Depends on where you are in the country. I think Wellington at the moment is more affordable than it's been in a very long time, and that's a feature of three things. One, household incomes, which are stable.
Yeah.
Two, mortgage interest rates, which are coming down. And three, the cost of housing, which has obviously dropped away in Wellington. So the confluence of those three things together, when you calculate them together as one, mean that the cost of housing in Wellington is lower than I think it's been. I can't remember exactly how long, but it's quite some period of time. The figure's pretty good in most other parts of the country as well. It's skewed a little bit like Auckland. So if you take Auckland out of the equation, in most parts of the country, affordability's come back. Or gone up, depending on how you want to define it, over the last few months. And it will stay there, basically, sort of hark back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about supply. As long as there's still stock available, it will continue to be around that mark and probably drop even further as interest rates come down. But at some point, we'll get back to equilibrium in the market, and then we'll see a slow increase in house prices, and that will mean affordability will slowly erode away again.
Yeah. For those that can't buy and haven't, I see that data from Trade Me Property shows the national median weekly rent has risen by 25% over the past 5 years, from about 510 to 640. Although I would have thought, Ash, with more rentals available, I mean, we've just been talking about availability. At the moment, they do have more bargaining power.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, and I know we're talking again a little bit later in this call about that private members bill, but all of this is based on a misunderstanding about how rentals work. So there's a perception, I think, among a lot of people, particularly renters, that landlords are fat cats who go out there and try and extract the maximum rent that they can from their poor, long-suffering tenant. The problem with that, and this has been the case in New Zealand since at least the early 2020s and possibly longer, is the days of buying a rental investment property and having the rent cover all of the outgoings on that property are long gone, Leah. When you own an investment property now, the costs of owning that property, the rent, the insurance, the maintenance, all of the mortgage interest, etc., all of those costs, in most cases, particularly if you're in Auckland or in the bigger centres, far outweigh the rent that you actually earn on the property, which means that the landlord is actually subsidising the tenant, and in some cases subsidising the tenant by quite a significant amount of money. So this idea that rent increases are about landlords trying to extract more money out of the tenants is just wrong. And it's interesting because when you look at the market overall and you consider what's happening at the moment in this talk of a 25% increase over 5 years, when you look at what's happened over that 5 years, what happened in particular is mortgage interest rates, what that tells me is that landlords just went further backward, and that they've been able to recover a small portion of that additional cost, but certainly nothing like what that cost, what actually cost them to own. By the way, it's worth pointing out, because somebody's going to say or text you and say, well, why would anybody to bother to own an investment property? And the reason for that is capital gain. The reason for that is capital gain. So in theory, the property value goes up over time and offsets the fact that it's actually cost you that money in the interim, and you actually make a little bit on it. But that's not guaranteed. And in fact, over the last 2 or 3 years, property values have gone backwards. So not only has it cost you to own a property, but the value of that property itself has gone backwards. So it's a double whammy hit.
It is. I mean, and I think we have talked about this before. If you don't have to sell your investment property, don't, obviously, but I do know people that have been forced to because of their financial situation, and I've got to say, Ash, none of the ones I know actually made any money off them. And one did, and only made something like, after paying the bills and paying other stuff, I think they walked away with about 20,000. I mean, seriously?
Yeah.
One lost 300,000.
I've said before, and I've probably said to you, I just think that landlords perform an enormously important service. And the reason I say that is because there's about 500,000 people in this country who rent property for all sorts of reasons, who decide to rent rather than own their own home, or in a position where they have to rent rather than own their own home. And the government actually only owns about 65 to 70,000 rental units, which means all the rest of those are provided by the private sector. So if you didn't have those landlords who owned that property and were taking a loss on it, that would have to be provided by the state, which means you and me. That would bankrupt the country.